I'm releasing what is pretty much an unedited version of this for those who just want to pass the time hearing the ramblings of an old man. I'm going to make use of parts of it for later videos as well. I'm just going to ramble on and edit this later. I watched a YouTube video about Pennsylvania Dutch, and German is involved in Texas, for example, around Fredericksburg. And it impressed me that there are so many stories from different times. The zeitgeist. That made me realize that in the time and place I grew up, which was 1950s, late 1950s, in Georgia, in what was then a rural area, Stone Mountain, Georgia, how unique that must have been. I mean, to me, it was what I was used to, but I never lived in a big city. So I didn't realize how, in many ways, things were so unique. And looking back on it, so wonderful. Life was so simple back then, at least for us, in that time and in that place. The family owned or controlled about 21 acres of land, which we did a little bit of farming, raised a few animals, in addition to the day jobs of the men. So I was exposed to that part of life. I have some friends who are real dog lovers in the sense of dogs as pets. Well, back when I was growing up and in that place, animals served a purpose. They didn't have a purpose, and you weren't going to feed them. You weren't going to go to that expense. So a dog, if it wasn't a hunting dog or a dog for protection, you would own a dog, not just that concept was totally alien to me. The same with other animals. We raised animals to ultimately become food. So you didn't want to get friendly with them because you might have to eat them for supper. I also had to tend to them and sometimes butcher them. So it was hard to think of them as anything other than a food source. That had its pros and cons. This whole concept of animals as pets is really an outgrowth, I think, of our prosperity. Back when I was growing up, while we were not poor, raising your own food was important. It allowed us to do other things with our money. So that's something that people who weren't raised back then, it's hard for them to understand. So I think it's important to put that down on video. I've written some of this down in my journals, but this puts a face to the words, maybe in a comical fashion or horror fashion. But anyway, I want to talk about some of those things. And being in the South, during the time of James Crowe, or Jim Crowe, actually. Sorry. And anybody who didn't live back then may not know what that is. Most people of color in this country would know what that is because they understand the discrimination that came with segregation. But you know, even in that regard, of course, I'm speaking from a white perspective. So our view of that time would be certainly altogether different. But there was the thing about the 50s that I fondly look back on is how safe everything was. And it was easy to know what was expected of you in terms of your actions, what you could expect from the world. And growing up, even when I would go with my father to his business in downtown Atlanta, we would go out, my brother and I would have been about, I would have been about 12 and he would have been 8. We would walk from my father's store down to a ballpark that was 6 or 8 blocks south of his store and watch a double header and walk back at midnight just by ourselves with absolutely no fear of molestation. It was safe. Part of that, of course, was because of things that are now looked upon as police overreach. But not back then. And I'm sure that was something that the police culture at the time may have abused. But for we law-abiding citizens, it was really a blessing because basically it removed so much of the crime from the streets. And on that topic, in 1972, I worked for the crime lab in Atlanta Police Department. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was in 72 or early 70s anyway, where the Miranda ruling came out that required the police to advise suspected criminals of their rights. And to me, what I actually saw during that period of time is that I think has contributed more to our current crime problems than anything else. Here again, I think that was before that ruling, the way police were allowed to interrogate, I'm sure brought about some abuses. But at any rate, a lot of people will probably comment about that statement, but at any rate, that was my experience. So for me, all of the 50s and early 60s were great. Of course, for me, the world totally changed with the Vietnam War. I think there, let me back up just a little bit and say something. I guess deep down, I'm a pacifist. I don't want to fight unless, well, I don't want to fight. I will if I have to, but I don't want to. And so to me, the last righteous war that the U.S. was involved in was World War II. Everything else has been wars have revolved around philosophy or religion, neither of which do I feel like we should end lives for. I've got a bad habit of digressing, but maybe with what I'm trying to achieve in this video list is worth the digression, or the purpose, or maybe the lens to the objective. Anyway, for example, to see how that worked, let me back up just a bit. Getting back to the Jim Crow and the desegregation of the South, other than some much publicized events and violence that came with that, in our area, Atlanta, Stone Mountain, all that area, it really wasn't such a big deal. I mean, in later years, I was doing a programming project, and one of the ladies I was working with, one of the programmers, I was a Black lady and very well educated, more than me. And at the time, I was a smoker, and she smoked as well, so we had to go outside the building and smoke. And we struck up an ongoing conversation about desegregation and racial prejudice and things like that. And she was very she'd done a lot of study on that subject. So I'd had a theory for some time about the Civil War, or as we call it down here in the South, the war between the states. And why that happened and what would have happened if there hadn't been a Civil War. Because it was a terrible, terrible thing, not just for the South, but for everybody concerned. And it accomplished, from a racial point of view, negative results. People up north probably will not understand that, but my grandmother was raised in Edwardsville, Alabama. Her name was Zorah, which is a name from the Old Testament. Her dad was a Methodist minister. But at any rate, they had moved into Georgia and settled in a place that was probably the center of Sherman's march to the sea. And on Sherman's march, which, by the way, created the concept of total warfare, they basically destroyed everything that supported life from a 150-mile wide path as it went to the sea. In Sherman's defense, that was what it was going to take to end the war. Crazy, crazy. But anyway, my grandma was born in 1886. So that was, 14 years after, 12, 14 years after the Civil War ended. But the South, of course, suffered for decades after the war ended. For example, Atlanta, Georgia really didn't achieve anything like modern status until the early 50s, because it had been totally destroyed by the war. So my grandma, who had 3 of her own children and 6 stepchildren that she had to raise, and her husband that was who died, so she was left to raise all of them. So the Southern view of the black people was that they were slaves, they were former slaves. It's a bad thing, but that's the view at the time. So they would, if at all possible, not hire freed black people, but instead would hire white people when they were available. So my grandma worked in the cotton fields, doing essentially what the slaves had done for 25 cents a day. She did that for years and years and years. So the outcome of the Civil War set up the racial problems in the South for decades and for a couple of generations. And in my theory, that was all avoidable. What would have happened if we hadn't had a Civil War and there hadn't been any kind of national proclamation to end slavery? Slavery, owning slaves was an expensive proposition. Most people don't think about the economics of it, but it was an expensive proposition. And basically, the bulk of the slave ownership was by plantation owners. Cotton was king back then. They raised cotton, harvest it, gin it, and bale it, and it went to England where they make fabrics. So what is often overlooked in looking at historical things, and by the way, I looked at watched a YouTube video about what if the South had won. Like that was even. Anyway, if there hadn't been a war, what would have happened? Well, the thing that caused big rush or demand for slaves back then was the invention of the cotton gin. For those of you who've never raised or picked cotton, you might be surprised to know that there's a lot of seed in those balls of cotton. And those have to be removed for the cotton to have any value at all. Well, before the cotton gin, those things were picked out by hand. Forgive me if I offend anybody, but here again, I'm trying to speak the truth the way it was, good, bad, and ugly. There was a term for slave children. They were often called pickaninnies. And the best I can fathom where that term came from was before the cotton gin, they would use slave children to pick out the cotton seed. So, but that was a slow process, and then it was manually combed. It was just a lot of work, manual labor required to get that cotton to be useful. And then the cotton gin came along, and that became an automated process, and now they can gin cotton faster than they could raise it. So that put thousands of acres of land into cultivation of cotton, which would not have happened without the cotton gin, because if you raised it, you wouldn't have any way of processing it to sell. So that was the first scientific invention that impacted our Southern culture. But what would have happened if there had been no Civil War? Well, slavery, remember at one time slavery was legal all over the United States and much of the world. Now, why did it disappear from the North? Well, the North moved from an agricultural culture to industrial culture much faster than the South. And when machines came on the scene, they were just simply cheaper to use than slaves. So it became economically unnecessary to use slave labor to do things. Would that have happened in the South? Well, the South was going to remain agriculturally specific because of the great demand for cotton. But let's look at what came about scientifically that would have changed things. And remember, these things would have happened much faster had there not been such a destructive war. The farm implements that would have replaced the need for slave labor, the plows, the combines, all the things that just were eliminating the need for labor. I mean, look at today. My father-in-law had a small farm up in North Georgia, and he was telling me that when he first started, they were lucky to get 8 bushels of corn per acre. And they did that with a tremendous amount of labor. Although they had tractors and farm implements to do things, but still, the yield was terrible. And before he retired and gave up farming, he was getting over 200 bushels of corn per acre, and he never had to plow the ground. And all that came from all the scientific advancements. I mean, they would basically go in and put down a herbicide and kill everything that was on the ground, and they would go in and spray something else. And after a certain amount of time passed, then they'd come up with a machine that would poke the seed in the ground and then come back behind that with fertilizer. And they had their own irrigation systems, so it had to depend on whether or not they were going to get rain. Anyway, back to my point. So what would have happened is that in my opinion, slaves would have been emancipated by their owners simply because they weren't profitable to own anymore. I mean, that's harsh, but that's the time it was. But what effect would that have had on racial the racial climate in the South? The freedom of slaves by the violence of the war, to say the least, wasn't appreciated in the South. And a lot of that resentment, hatred, whatever you want to call it, was focused on the blacks, who were the subject of the emancipation. So, let me get back to that lady that I was talking about that I worked with, and the study she did on racial relations. In fact, she did her MBA that was focused on that very subject. So she was much better educated than I was. So her family had moved to the north, actually before the Civil War. And so we were talking about racial problems, discrimination and whatnot. And I asked her, why did she move back to the South? She said, well, most white people, for sure, don't really understand the difference in discrimination in the South and in the North. She said, in the South, discrimination is social or a class, not necessarily an individual. So, but she says up north, it's very personal. They hate me because I'm black. So, and that made a lot of sense to me, because as I was growing up during the Jim Crow days in the theater in Stone Mountain, a little tiny theater, but it had a balcony. And there was a separate entrance for blacks to go in, and they would sit in the balcony. And the whites would go through the front door and sit closer to the screen. And I never thought anything about that. And yet I had some black, I wouldn't, it'd be too much to call them friends because we just didn't associate. It wasn't the fact that I liked or disliked them. It's just the fact that we just, I mean, back then the schools were segregated, so there were no blacks in school. So if you ended up knowing a black person as you were growing up, it was happenstance. And so, but I did have some black acquaintances, would be a better way of putting it. And I felt no animosity toward them whatsoever. We didn't think about it much. Well, I really digressed, haven't I? Anyway, these are the kinds of things that I want to address in my videos before my experiences get lost to whatever. I mean, I valued so much my grandmother, who taught me so much about days much earlier than mine, and what it was like to grow up during the late 1800s. For example, she told me about the first time she saw an electric light, first time she saw a car. So many things, and I'm not going to get into that. I may do a separate video on that just to preserve those memories she passed on to me. Anyway, let me get my thoughts together here. I'll probably edit this out, hopefully. I'll edit this out. I think what I'm going to do is continue to ramble, which will make a huge video, very long one, and then go back and edit it, chop it up, and try to put it, create some kind of association between my recollections so that they'll have some kind of topic. So I'm just going to let this thing run instead of pausing it. I guess the modern term would be I'd handle it in post-production. At any rate, I'm blessed from the standpoint I had a very interesting life, very varied life, from growing up on a small farm to holding meetings in the penthouse of McDonnell Douglas office in Irvine, California. So I've seen a lot in my life. Most of it not by planning, but happenstance, which means I was very lucky or unlucky being in the right or wrong place at the right or wrong time. I guess the best example of that is during the Vietnam War, I was subject to the draft, and my number was going to come up pretty soon. And as I've stated earlier, I'm sort of a pacifist and certainly didn't see any point in going to a senseless war like Vietnam. That's no, I don't mean that in any kind of negative fashion for the guys that went and served. Wasn't their doing. It's just them being at the wrong place in the wrong time. So instead of that, I looked around at the various services where I might be able to get some kind of training that would be useful. off the battlefield. So anyway, I took a test for the Air Force to qualify for electronics school. So I ended up in the Air Force, hoping to avoid ground service in Vietnam. But to show you how things work out, I ended up in the Middle East in '69 on a project. In fact, you can see, if you see the pictures in the background, that's me in front of that panel. You can see those big tropospheric scatter antennas in the next one over. Anyway, that's what I was doing in Turkey. And unfortunately, that involved, remember, this is during the Cold War. So, since Turkey borders the Black Sea and the Soviet Union at the time, it was a perfect place for U.S. intelligence to operate. So in our particular location, it was really, the Air Force provided the infrastructure and the operation of the facility. And probably 80% of the traffic we handled was U.S. military related. We probably provided 80% of the encrypted traffic to Southeast Asia, for example. But the CIA had arrangements with the Turkish government at the time to provide encrypted communications for their military. Now, the encryption process and equipment was far too secret and specialized to trust anybody. So basically, the CIA was taking the traffic in the clear, encrypting it, sending it to the other end, and then encrypting it. So that ran through our station. A lot of it did. Certainly anything around Ankara. And unfortunately, while I was there was a military coup. Middle East, surprise, surprise. And so we were taken hostage, or prisoner, if you will, which is not anything I'd ever expected back then. Now in the Middle East, I wouldn't go back there on a dare. Because when things like that happen, it's sudden, at least from our viewpoint. I happen to be in downtown Ankara. I'll pronounce it in English fashion, Ankara. In front of the U.S. Embassy when that broke out. It was an unmarked crew cab pickup, and we weren't allowed to wear uniforms. Our group was not, because of the nature of it was all top secret stuff. But we had to go down to Ankara, to the U.S. Embassy to pick up crypto cards. I won't get into what that is, but it's terribly secret for anybody, of course, Donald Trump. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. I'm trying to not get into politics. Religion and politics, the two curses of mankind. Anyway, so I was sitting out there, and one of the guys went in to pick up the diplomatic pouch that contained the cards. This was a routine thing because you could only use a card set for 24 hours, and then you had to change. So we needed those for all the encryption stuff to work. So we were sitting out there, and this is just down the street from Ankara Turkey University. And this is a beautiful day, sunshine, not too hot. It's nice. And then suddenly we saw this crowd of people coming out of the university. with signs and stuff. Didn't think too much about it until they started turning over cars and setting them on fire. The Turkish government at the time was, and still is, I guess, to some degree, military dictatorship. I got stories I can tell about that, but in another place. Anyway, instead of policemen on the streets, they had military personnel. So there were 2 Turkish soldiers just north of the embassy who went over to address that problem. And when the violence broke out, they started setting the cars on fire. These 2 poor Turks started firing into the crowd with their AK-47s. And they used the big banana clips, which is what, 40 rounds, something like that. But number one rule in the Middle East, if you're going to shoot into an angry mob, be sure you have enough ammunition to kill them all. And of course, the 80 rounds they fired into that crowd was not near enough. So the next thing I'm seeing, and this is about 100 yards away, seemed closer because with the firing of those weapons, it seems pretty close. And the sound of the crowd and everything. And I'm not sitting there like. So they overtook the 2 soldiers. The next thing I see is body parts, arms and legs of the soldiers being passed over the heads of the crowd. I mean, you know, they'd just been, there was death and carnage there. They were already upset, and that certainly was like, anyway, those poor Turkish soldiers died at that point, and I witnessed that. So we're sitting there inside the embassy. Of course, the Marines had already been alerted there was a problem. So our guy who had the top secret security bag, they weren't allowing him to leave there with that top secret information. And yet that was our orders to go pick that up. So he was debating what to do there. You know, we were out there exposed. You know, come out. We didn't want to leave him because we thought that the target of the riot, or whatever you want to call that, was the U.S. Embassy. In fact, it wasn't. The U.S. Embassy wasn't touched. It was basically a military incited coup. So finally, he just left the bag there in the embassy and came out, and we did a U-turn on Ataturk Boulevard and headed south. Now, the mountaintop on which we had those, see those antennas up there? That photo? Those things were like 30 feet tall and 60 feet wide. But anyway, on the mountaintop, it's called Elmadag. Was northeast of Ankara. But, I mean, in 30 minutes, there was a war going on. I mean, we could feel the ground shake from artillery. So we headed south to avoid that. Electricity was already out. And we were going to need fuel to make it back up the hill. We finally found a gas station on the south side that had the old hand crank gasoline pumps. So we traded cigarette, because we'd been to the PX first, because all the guys on the hill were 60 of us. Would use these strips we made. We'd go by the PX and they'd give us a list of stuff they wanted with the money. So cigarettes was a big deal, whatever. So we had a good cargo of cigarettes. Well, American cigarettes was better than US dollars. So we traded cigarettes for the fuel. And then went way southeast, around that way. It took us about 16 hours on a trip that ordinarily would be about 4 hours to get back to the site. when we got up there, the Turks who were providing our security, we were unarmed. I qualified on small arms that year with a BB pistol with a target on the back of the CO's locker door. Crazy. Anyway, so we got up there, and the Turks already set up sandbags and razor wire and set up their machine guns in placements to defend our position. So that made us feel pretty safe, right? So we got in there and explained to the commander that we didn't have the crypto cards, which meant we were going to be inoperative soon, a week or two anyway, when we run out of card sets. So I forgot what we did about that. Honest to goodness, things got so crazy. I don't even remember any of that. Then I didn't have direct clearance on the crypto equipment anyway, so I wouldn't have been. But anyhow, the 3 days into the coup, the commanding officer of the Turkish contingent who was guarding the place came in and told my commander that they had switched sides and that we were now prisoners. So they moved the machine guns on the other side of the sandbags, and they were pointed at us. And we were getting no supplies, no food. Our CO, which handled things pretty well, only made one mistake, I think, and that was the fact that he didn't immediately, but on the first hour of that, start rationing food. I think it's safe to assume that he thought, with good reason, that the U.S. military wouldn't allow that to happen. We were just too indispensable for the communications efforts. You know, and I don't know. We also had to keep, during that period of time, they could send traffic by high frequency, but those had to be manually encrypted. And maybe they resorted to that. I just can't remember. So anyway, here we are. We're not armed. Our orders from our CO were to continue doing our jobs, which we did, best I can remember. But anyway, we were held hostage for 32 days, and our food ran out pretty quick. We had pretty well exhausted everything in 2 weeks, and that was after going on rations. Ordinarily up there, being an isolated post, we ate very well, and we got supplies on a very regular basis. Anyway, a lot of good things to eat, and a lot of it. But when the supplies were cut off, that changed dramatically. So it was about, in 2 weeks, we had nothing to eat. And one of the men who was responsible for plant maintenance, that is the buildings and infrastructure, had remembered that there was an old barrel of Korean War vintage powdered eggs that somebody just thrown into the foundation of the building. Why, I don't know. But anyway, they dug that out. Now, this was dated 1952. And these powdered eggs were preserved with sulfur. And they were green. You know, the fellow that wrote the book, Green Eggs and Ham. Anyway, so that was what we had to eat for the next 3 weeks. And it would have been just, I guess we'd have finally eaten it. But we were blessed by the fact that the one thing we had in the way of food supplies left was ketchup. So we would basically, the cooks would cook up those powdered eggs, green eggs, and they smelled of sulfur. And we would just cover it with ketchup. That's what we survived on, mostly. Although some of the guys traded cigarettes to the Turks who were guarding us for homemade bread. These are, the bread in the homemade. Well, at any rate, we all developed dysentery or something from sharing all that bread. And remember, this is 60 guys and 4 toilets. Those are the kinds of things I really remember. So it was pretty bad, but the worst of it came when we had a sergeant who got it in his mind that he was going to escape. And he talked the airmen into going with him. So the 2 of them got into a crew cab pickup truck and crashed through the barricade that the Turks had set up. Well, the Turks, who I don't think meant us any harm, at least the ones like guarding us, anyway, were obliged to open fire, which they did. The sergeant was killed instantly. The airman was pulled out of the crashed vehicle and beaten to the point where we weren't sure he was going to survive. And I don't even know if he actually did survive. We did finally negotiate to have him taken down to U.S. Balgan Air Base, and they flew him out to Germany for intensive treatment. I later packed up all of his personal stuff and sent it somewhere. But I don't really know what happened to him. So anyway, that was one casualty out of our 60 people. 2 actually, we consider the airman was gone one way or the other. And at that point, it really got to be very real, because by this point in time, remember, we didn't think that the military was going to leave us there that long. What we did not know is that the U.S. government was in negotiation with the new regime, because the rebels won. And what they wanted was for us to resume to them the same services we were providing to the old regime, which is basically communications, encrypted communications. We didn't know that. There's no need for us to know that as far as the military is concerned. So that was what the big delay was. The Turks had said, we're not going to harm these people. We're going to let them do their work. But we're not going to make it comfortable. They're not going to get their food. So that sort of put a deadline ultimately on the negotiations, because at some point in time we'd have all died of starvation, I guess. But we didn't know any of that. And it was ultimately resolved. And as soon as we got our first supply truck up there, everything was back to normal. But it taught me several things about life in the Middle East and a lot of things. I grew up real quick. I was 21 years old at the time. Changed my whole perspective on life. When you really think you might die, and knowing how it might happen, and seeing the bodies of the sergeant and the condition that the airman was in firsthand, that's an unpleasant sight. Of course, my hat's off to the people who served like in Vietnam and saw that on a routine basis. Man, anyway, the good thing about the Air Force, talking about being in the right place at the right time, was that the Air Force was converting from analog to digital. And so I was on the ground floor of the very earliest digital everything. So when I got out, and I got an early out because of the hostage situation. I'm still trying to get the DOD to classify that as a POW status, but I don't know why they wouldn't. But at any rate, I'd like to have my status clarified. Anyway, the good news is that it gave me a foundation in computers back when they were in their infancy, when they were just, I mean, the biggest mainframe in that day and time had only 100th of the power of your smartphone. Even as late as 1999, I met a fellow up in Maryland who worked for the Social Security Administration. He was bragging about the fact they just brought online 1 terabyte of disk storage. In this room, right now, I've got 10 terabytes of online storage. Oh well, and that was back before Elon Musk showed us the 1950s science fiction, where the ships in those old sci-fi movies would take off and then they'd land on their tail. When I saw the first SpaceX first stages landing, oh man, did that bring back some memories. But anyway, so I got into the computer programming business. Not immediately. What I experienced in the Middle East impacted me in ways I didn't even realize. So when I got back home, I got married to a woman I was married to for 49 years. She passed away 3 years ago. But anyway, but it impacted me in ways I didn't really understand. So I went back to college, and I went to a college that was partially funded by the Southern Baptist Convention, which meant I had to take a lot of theology courses and philosophy. Well, now I'm going deep down that memory vortex. But one of the courses that I appreciated most in that 4 years was early American literature, of all things. And I was really searching around for some kind of religious foothold or foundation or whatever. And so in that, I read works by people like Jonathan Edwards, Cotton Mather, all the Puritan writers. Back then, they would write their sermons out longhand, and later those would be collected and bound into volumes and books. Cotton Mather, for example, had like 200 volumes, 200 books of sermons. He was a Congregationalist minister. And back then, ministers didn't get paid much of anything, so he also ran a pretty good-sized farm. And by the way, he was one of the judges on the Salem witch trials. Oh, Lord. Anyway, what impressed me about those people that day. And these were educated people at a time when very few people were educated. But the fact that most of them studied Greek and Hebrew and Latin, their writings were of a quality you don't see anymore. For example, Jonathan Edwards, 12 years old, wrote some stuff that, I mean, it was 12-year-old, and just stuff that was so profound. Sure, he was gifted. I mean, it wasn't just that he accidentally fell into that, but it was a time when education involved reading the classics and all the philosophical literature and religious literature. So there was a lot of just pure thinking that went on. I mean, look at the fundamental things that we take for granted today, the theory of gravity and this stuff that, anyway, I'm digressing too far. But anyway, that served me well to get my head straight, I think. But as a detour for getting my head straight, my wife and I volunteered for missionary service. Then we went down to Mexico to work with the poorest of the poor. God, there's stories I can tell you about that they're almost unbelievable. If I didn't have pictures to go with it, I don't know if I'd believe it myself. But at any rate, that was a good 2 years. And but by the time I finished that, I began to understand that, and combined with the stuff going on in the Middle East, the real damage that religion does to society and people. I mean, so make a long story short, I'm not religious. Now, I still have my beliefs, but I'm not religious. And I feel absolutely no obligation to make you believe what I believe. That is certainly your own personal business. And mine came at a real high personal cost, but nevertheless, it really settled me, made me more comfortable with life and life's meaning and everything. So it was a good thing. So, but after that, let me jump back a little bit. But after I got married, one of the first jobs I had was working in the crime lab at Atlanta Police Department. That would have been in 1972. And we worked crime scenes. And in 1972, Atlanta was labeled the murder capital of the United States. And so we worked, I think in the 6 months I was on the force there, I worked 350 some odd scenes of violent death. They weren't all necessarily murders, but a good portion of them were. And I saw scenes of people being killed in ways you can't even imagine. And the brutality, absolute brutality. I'll recount one story, one incident that made me a firm believer in the death penalty, for example. Even though I'm a pacifist, there's some people, they're like a rabid dog. It's not the dog's fault he's rabid, but you can't let him run around the neighborhood, so you put him down. Anyway, this case of 7-Eleven convenience store robbery. This guy comes in with a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun. After the clerk gave him the money, he had the lady open up her mouth, and he put the the shotgun in her mouth, pulled the trigger, blew the back of her head off. So anyway, they finally caught him. And because of the Miranda ruling, we had to photograph prisoners, certainly on major cases, before and after every interrogation, just to show they weren't beaten or whatever. Anyway, I was in there. Ordinarily, I never have contact with the suspect, except in those instances where I had to photograph them. And the detention officer that was in there was talking to him, and he says, "Man, why didn't you shoot the lady?" And he said, "It was 7 or 7. Let me explain what that means. At that particular time, the death penalty in Georgia had been struck down by the courts as being discriminatory. So, and they had no replacement. Later on, they replaced it with a sentence of life imprisonment without chance of parole, but they didn't have that at the time. So regardless of how outrageous the crime was, technically, the prisoner would be eligible for a parole hearing in 7 years. So what he meant by 7 or 7, he had thought this through. In other words, if I kill this witness, I may not get caught at all. And if I do, I'm still eligible for parole in 7 years. And the armed robbery was a 20-year sentence. So he felt like he had nothing to lose by killing that woman. And I'm convinced, had there been a death penalty, that woman would be alive, been left alive. But anyway, those are the kinds of experiences I had. It was after that my wife and I decided to go to the mission field, try to do some good, which, all religion aside, I think we really did, mainly because my wife's a registered nurse, and down where we were in nowhere, Mexico, actually a place called Oinakachi, that's nowhere. And certainly back then it was nowhere. She was essentially practicing medicine because people had no other choice. And she saved a lot of lives. As far as I know, we didn't kill anybody. Could have. We were dispensing penicillin to people with absolutely no medical history, and nothing we could have done for them had they gone into shock from reaction to penicillin. But we never saw that happen. So then we did see the lives that were saved by, we talk about miracle drugs, antibiotics. Well, up here we are so, we've taken so many antibiotics, we have to take stronger and stronger antibiotics to do any good. But down there, that was this was 1976 through 79. These people had never had an antibiotic in their lives. So if you saw somebody with pneumonia and you give them penicillin, it's a miracle. And we did that a few times when we first got down there because it was hard to get. This was Indian culture, Yamada Indians. And it was hard to get accepted. Spanish was a second language to me, and it was second language to them. And I had no clue as to their native dialect. It was not a written language. Anyway, we finished that tour. We did some good there. But because of religion, our term of service was cut short. At that time, I pretty much held to the Calvinistic theology. And the mission board I was with was more of a Bob Jones University, Tennessee Temple variety. To show you how ridiculous it was, they believed the only inspired word of God was the King James version of the Bible. So what was I supposed to do? Teach the people in Mexico King James English? That's the reason it's pointless to argue religion, because it's not rational. You believe whatever you want to. But anyway, getting away from that, so came back from that. I did various jobs. By then I had a college degree, so I thought, well, the first job I actually had this is before the mission field. Let me digress again. My first job after graduating from college was teaching high school. Oh God, was that talking about a difference between the time I was in school back in the 50s and 60s and 1976 is just like stepping into another alternate universe. So I taught for one semester and realized, thank goodness, that was not my calling. Then we went to the mission field. When we got back, it was in the middle of a recession. Brenda, of course, had no trouble getting employed, being a registered nurse. So essentially, for a few months there, other than the odd jobs I could pick up, she was supporting us, which was a big dent to my male ego. So I finally got a job as a merchandiser for the division of Crowe. Did a couple of years of that, a lot of travel, on the road constantly. But after they closed the Atlanta office, I was going to have to be forced to move to Cincinnati, and I didn't want to do that. So I left that job and went back to work in my father's camera store and repair shop. And he had thousands of parts for hundreds of different cameras. And he had his own little system of how to find things which nobody else would ever be able to understand. So I, using my interest in knowledge of computers that I picked up from the Air Force, I bought a TRS-80 Radio Shack computer. And that really shows my age. Remember, the PC wasn't brought out until 1982. And when it was just an 8-bit computer with no hard drive, just anyway. So I wrote a inventory program for the shop, and I did that between waiting on customers and other chores you have to do in retail. But I was doing that on a counter surface that the customers would see, not intentionally, but that's the only place I had to work. And so I had a fellow come in from an accounting service. Now, this is back in the days when they were using mechanical journals. I'm not even going to get, it's a mechanical device. I'm not even going to get into how that worked. But in his office, they had about 20 people running these things, and it was like the noise was incredible. And it's slow. Of course, it was very inefficient. So he saw me writing that inventory software. And he said, "Could you do accounting software?" And I said, "I don't see why not." And so anyway, long story short, I ended up writing an accounting package, what they would call in the business a client write-up package. Basically, people would bring in all the original documents, and these people would key it in and produce financial statements. A simple business application, actually. But on that Radio Shack machine, only had 128 KB memory, RAM memory, and single-sided 5.5-inch floppy drive, which would hold 64 KB. Anyway, so it was a challenge to write that from the standpoint I had to be able to sort a lot of data for those financial statements, and not enough memory to do that. So anyway, I finally accomplished it by writing the application in the basic language that came with the Radio Shack, plus Z80A assembler, and some 1972 COBOL. And to use it, the ladies would have to change, it would prompt them to change disk, because the data was, for a single month, not add up to 50 disk, floppy disk. And they have to be prompted to change them. But for the ladies who were doing that, that was a lot better than those loud machines. Anyway, I was paid $10,000 for that. And in that day and time, that would have been about 1981, I guess, or early 82. That was an incredible amount of money. Talking about a side gig. That was really great. And then one of his competitors heard about the application he was running, and he came in the store and wanted to know if he could buy a copy of it. I said, sure. So I sold the second copy for $10,000. And I thought, man, this is a way to make money. You know, you keep selling something you do once and sell it many times. Anyway, after that, I finally got employed by an international company as their lead programmer, and wrote one of the first automated inventory systems in the Southeast. And that was sort of my claim to fame. And from there, I was taken on as a partner in another company that did government software. And that's where I was able to really get my accounting skills perfected. We did government software, which meant fund accounting, encumbrance purchasing. Back then, it was the Federal Red Book. I don't know what the official title of that was, but it was a specifications of a red bound book. It was the federal rules of how governments had to do accounting. Anyway, I'm getting too much detail on that. So for the next, well, up until 2005, that's what I did for a living, programming. I could get into a whole hours and hours of the transition in the computer software business. I guess at my height, I was, for example, I was a keynote speaker at Comdex. So I had a little bit of notoriety. I won't call it fame. Nobody remembers my name, because on that same platform was a fellow by the name of Bill Gates. Here I was giving my little speech using 3x5 note cards. When he came, fortunately, I spoke before he did. If he'd done his presentation first, I would have left. Because when he comes up there, it rolls out the whole multi-video extravaganza thing. So I'm sitting there in my chair. Oh, God, am I really here? But at that time, I was the vice president of the McDonnell Douglas Computer Vendors Association. So we would hold our meetings out in Irvine, California, in the penthouse of their office building. I was really a jet setter back then. I was making enough money that I could take the family for a weekend vacation anywhere. So we made a lot of trips to California, like for a weekend. But at the height of my career, I guess you call it the height, at least financially speaking, the company I founded was taking in about $450,000 a month. So, I felt like I was in a life that was never going to end. A lot of Gatsby kind of feelings there. Excuse me. Then the crash of '87. I'm a pretty good planner, but I never saw that one coming. So our business model is based on royalties from the sales of things, not any kind of ongoing maintenance. So basically, our revenue was based on what we sold that day. And the crash of '87 was so severe. Those of you who didn't live through that won't have a clue, but it was so severe that businesses weren't doing any capital spending at all. Now, we had the premier point of sale system at the time. Nobody could compete. We were doing systems that ran about $10,000 per checkout line, whereas National Cash Register and IBM, that would run you about $100,000 or $150,000 per checkout line. So for the small businesses, we had no competition. But from one day to the next, suddenly we had no sales. We had like 5 contracts be signed that following week, and all of them bugged out. But because I was being so successful, I was not putting any money aside. I was funneling everything back in to grow the business. Had I put back even 10%, I would have survived that crash, but I didn't. And I didn't. So that was another milestone in my life where I had to make a lot of adjustments. And some of them in a very good way. To go from so much money that it was coming in faster than you could spend it, to having no money coming in is an interesting experience. And certainly after that, I never failed to put money aside. And fortunately, that came at a good time in my life because my kids were still young, and I taught them based on my experience. If you can't pay cash for it, you got to have a really, really compelling reason to buy anything on credit. So after that, well, in 1985, I think it was the last car I bought that I had to finance. Since then, I paid cash for every car I've owned. And cars that I bought for my kids, I paid cash for those. Anyway, aside from the fact that the computer business was changing, in that we basically worked ourselves out of a job. I mean, back when I was writing software, this was the very foundations of what we take for granted today. And everything was built upon that. But moreover, the computer hardware became so fast and storage became so cheap that you could write sloppy code, and that was fine because basically the hardware is a lot cheaper than the programmers. I mean, I was blessed when it came up at the time when we made serious money, but I forgot what year it was that IBM said they're not going to pay more than $35 an hour for contractors. That was the end of the line. And by then the software evolved to the point where if you could point and click a mouse, you could write some kind of business application. And I mean, you still had a core group of people who were writing the underlying machine code, and you know, the dyed-in-the-wool C and C++ programmers still made good money, but anything in the language above that was, you weren't getting paid squat. But anyway, I retired in 2005. And I was able to do that so early for two reasons. This gets back to being at the right place at the right time. My service in the Air Force qualified me for veterans benefits, particularly medical benefits. So I would have not have been able to retire when I did without that, because I would have had no medical coverage. And individual policies were just so expensive. So I was blessed in that regard. I mean, the military did several things for me. Number one, I went to college on the GI Bill. I got my basic electronics training from the Air Force. And then later, I bought 3 different houses with VA loans. And I have VA medical coverage, which, by the way, is so superior to anything I could get anywhere else. I know some people badmouth the VA medical, but man, for me, it's been beautiful. They're so proactive, and it never gets down to, you know, anything about, I don't have to worry about it costing. I'm lucky from the standpoint that I have complete coverage. I don't have to pay any deductibles, so I pay not a penny for anything. And I'm type 2 diabetic, so all of those things associated with that come to me at no cost. So you're again blessed. I am. Let me digress to one other thing. Sometimes I have young people, this is very rare, sometimes I have young people ask what they should do for a living. Well, years ago, I'd say, well, you're going to need to go to college, learn computers, but now what I would say is radically different. And mainly it's to be sure you're not replaced by a robot or some other form of automation, some of which I wrote. I would either become an electrician or a plumber, a welder, almost anything in construction, because at least now construction is so varied and unstandard. There's no standard, I guess. That requires humans to do it instead of robots. And before my wife passed away, she was an operating room nurse for 27 years, a circulator. And before she retired or left, she had Alzheimer's, so she had to leave the profession before retirement age. But before she left, which had been in, I guess, 2002, they were already using some computer-aided gadgets in the operating room. So, there's talk today about AI replacing a lot of the things that doctors do. But still, if you're going to have your pipes fitted, you're going to need a man to do that. You're going to have somebody weld, it's got to be doing that. I mean, there's a lot of automated welding, but those are on manufacturing processes, not repairs and other kind of projects. And the same with plumbing. Anything in the construction business, I guess, is safe. Hard work. I have a friend who made a good living in installing air conditioning ductwork. But by the time he was 35, man, he was a physical wreck. So, sorry, he retired from that business and got into something safer. He became a mercenary in the Middle East. Took advantage of his Marine Corps training. And he did that for several tours. But now he's into he's a contractor for security. And I'm talking about heavy security where they have automatic weapons and stuff like that. So he's got a good stable life now, making decent money. So he turned out fine for him. No replacement of the robot for him, or buy a robot. Anyway, I'm just rambling. I hope I can cut this thing up and edit it to where it makes a little better sense. And also in smaller sections so that you can stand and watch it. Although I may release an uncut version just to, so you can see an old man rambling. See, this is what happens to you when you get to be 75. If you're lucky, not dead or anyway, experiences. So I retired in 2005. I was working with a company then that did the software for the police cars, you know, in their cruiser software where they can look up your tag and your records and bolos and whatever, warrants and wants and warrants. So in 2005, being retired, my wife was still working. She enjoyed her work, and she did a tremendous service. I said she was forced to retire in 2002. That's incorrect. It was 2012. Sorry about that. All runs together. But she decided to go at some point in time. This would have been, I guess, 2005. She decided, or we decided, wouldn't it be interesting for her to do traveling nursing? At that time, we didn't own a home, we were just renting. So we thought, you know, with traveling nursing, you get your housing free. So we thought, hey, this would be you get to see the world and have no living expenses. Plus, the money was good for her and for us. So anyway, we went up to what was to be a 1-month assignment in Wyoming. And got up there and realized that they were going to renew her contract forever. She's getting paid $45 an hour, and all of her housing was provided. So they just couldn't get nurses up there. I mean, in the town we lived in, population, or the county we lived in, population was 8,100. There's a saying in Wyoming that there's more cows than people, which is probably true. And also we were right on and maybe was a part of the Shoshone Indian Reservation. So, and I don't know if they were counted in the population of I don't know. Anyway, it was, wasn't much to do up there for me. And I'd never been from the South. I'd never experienced 30 degrees below zero temperatures. So we were there for the winter. And since our car was not equipped with a block heater, we didn't have a heated shelter to put it in. On the worst days, I have to take the battery out of the vehicle, bring it inside. Otherwise, it would freeze, it would be ruined. Then take it out there the next morning in that cold temperatures and put it back in, fire it back up. In fact, it was so cold that the house we were living in was built for the weather. It had like double pane windows and things like that. But on the inside of the double pane windows, on the inside, ice would form about an inch all around the inside of the frame. You'd have to put on gloves or mittens to touch the doorknob of the door going outside, because otherwise your fingers would stick to the doorknob. It's a whole other story, and I've got a video about that, pretty good video about that experience up there in the territory. I mean, it's beautiful country. If I'd been younger and was a sportsman, fisherman, hunter, it'd be paradise. I saw a guy fishing at the reservoir up there. He threw away a fish about yay long, as long as my forearm. And I asked him why he did that. He said, "Oh, it's not worth taking home. It's too small." In Georgia, you would have mounted fish like that. But and of course, the first time I saw grizzly bear in its native habitat. Amazing animals. Buffalo, moose. What's the other big tall animal? Maybe it'll come to me. Anyway, these things are huge because they're made for that kind of climate. Elk. The reason they have such long legs is because in the winter, they got to have long legs to get through all the snow. I've got a picture of my oldest son, and the picture's dated June the 6th, and he's standing waist deep in snow. And one other thing that amazed me about Wyoming is, you'd think it'd be heavy, heavy snow. It's not. The snow was always just powder because it was so cold. And yet we'd have tremendous accumulations because it would never melt. Downtown was one street. And it was 4 lanes with a turn lane, which I never quite figured out why they needed a turn lane. There wasn't much traffic. You could do a U-turn rush hour. But anyway, before the winter was done, I figured out what they used that for. They would take the snow plows and they would put the snow into that. I guess it wasn't really a turn lane. It was made for the purpose of where do you put the snow? Having to truck it way off. Anyway, they keep putting the snow up there, and of course it never melted. So it'd get taller and taller and taller until it was about the height of a 1-story building. Before the spring came and it began to melt. And it melted, and it melted, and it melted. It was a unique experience, but I wouldn't want to do that again. That was pretty tough. So after that, we did a tour in Jacksonville, Florida. And then she came back. We came back to Lakeland, Florida, where 2 of my kids had settled. And she went to work in the hospital there and worked there until 2012. And at least in Lakeland, there were some things to do. Even after I retired, I had the illusion that I might want to get back into programming. But 2 things had happened, as I mentioned earlier, the death knell that IBM put on wages, and also they were giving out H-2 visas right and left to people from India. And they would work for less than $35 an hour. And also the business got to the point where you'd have 3 business analysis types for every programmer. In other words, the business became a camel. If you don't know what the definition of a camel is, it's a horse designed by committee. So I couldn't stand that corporate BS. They couldn't stand me. So the chances of me getting another job in that profession were nil. But fortunately, I'd accumulated some money, and not a whole lot, wasn't rich. And because my wife developed Alzheimer's, and that was a 6-year tragedy. So I went through a lot of the money during that period of time. But still, I wasn't penniless. And the fact that I didn't have to pay for medical, that was just, oh God, that was a blessing. My wife didn't have that benefit. And so anyway, I was pretty active in stocks back in 2005, for example. And I basically followed the philosophy known as buy and hold. And then the housing bubble crash of 2008, I lost about 60% of the value of my portfolio. And that made me question this whole buy and hold philosophy. And so I fortunately had enough cash on hand that I bought back into the stocks that had lost so much. And within a year, not only had I recovered my losses, but it was actually ahead. And I thought, well, it'd be nice to follow the philosophy of buy when it's low and sell when it's high. But in my age, that comes too infrequently. Maybe at any age, it's too infrequently. So I got into stock options. I read a book by Michael Sincere. I found that on Amazon. It was the first edition. I haven't read any of his current stuff, and there were 16 pages in that book that brought everything together for me. And that was selling covered options. Now, many people don't know what a stock option is, especially a contract where the writer of that contract is promising to buy or sell a stock at a specific price at a particular time or sooner, but it has an expiration date. And for that, the seller of that contract gets a premium. So I started dabbling in that, and I thought, man. Now you have to be careful with it. I've introduced several people to that, and most of them drop out when they get too greedy. It's a whole other subject. I've got to be patient. And I'll put up on the screen the address of my website where I've got years of detailed trading information. And I came up with a document for a concept that I came up with called transaction set. Won't get into that because if you don't see the document, you're not going to understand it. I don't even know what I'm talking about. But anyway, I got into that. And at that time, this was before the free trading. It was brought about by Robin Hood. Thank God for Robin Hood. So I was using, I think, Ameritrade or something like that. And they were making more on commissions than I was profit from the contracts, although I was making profit, so I stuck with it. But when Robinhood came out and did away with all the fees, it became very lucrative. Even before that, you had people like that were discounted, people that focused on options. And focused on people like me who were creating and writing the options, because that creates, think of it as a casino. All right, but you got to have chips for people to play, right? Well, if you write a stock option, it's like providing a chip to the players, and for that you get a fee. So anyway, we got in that pretty heavily, and at the height of that, I would have $100,000 in play at one time. That is, that we need $100,000 to cover the contracts I've written. Because these are covered contracts. I have to make good on the contract if it's exercised. Either have to buy the stock or sell the stock. So I either have to have the money or the stock. So anyway, but at the height, I was taking in sometimes $10,000 a week. Unfortunately, I'm in the group with T. Boone Pickens, the old oil wildcatter. He, like I, never saw what horizontal drilling was going to do to the oil industry. Talk about technology changing things. Back in the day, before horizontal drilling, you had to geologically find a big pool of oil. Then you'd have to drill down sometimes as much as 10,000 feet into that pool to get the oil out. So a well was very, very expensive, and you could only drill them where you found the pool of oil. They're not everywhere. I mean, there's oil over every inch of the earth, but it's not in quantities worth spending any money to get out. So anyway, but horizontal drilling and fracking was a game changer. So the thing I was making the most money in was the oil business on those contracts. But in the course of 6 months, a stock that I got into originally at $21 dropped to $7.75. And I got scared and got out. I took a $170,000 paper loss, a $30,000 actual loss on that one stock. Now, I had other things going on, so it wasn't. But anyway, it was lost income for sure. And unfortunately, I got out at $7.75. And I say unfortunately because basically, I don't want to get too much into stock option trading. Suffice it to say, if I'd stayed in it longer, I could cut my losses to maybe nothing, or maybe even netted a profit. But I got scared and I stayed out of that particular stock forever. Anyway, so that's what I've mainly been doing in my retirement in terms of making a living. I mean, I get the standard Social Security, and I do get a VA pension. So if I did nothing, I could live a pretty comfortable life. But the money I make from stock options is my spending money, play money, whatever you want to call it. Allows me to do hobbies like I've recently gotten into welding. In fact, I've got in my intro, I talk about welding. It's become my new passion. But also, well, like I say, I have a website and I'll post that. at the bottom. Of course, the other big event in my life was the passing of my wife. I'd never been alone before. Think about your life. I mean, when you're growing up, you had your family, right? People around you, school. Then me, I went from that to the service. So I had the comrades in arms, so to speak. When I got out, I got out in September of '69, and I was married by May of 1970. I was married 49 years. So I had never been alone before. And even after my wife passed away, I had children. So we never were a real close-knit group, but me and my oldest sons, or my oldest son, I've always been close, and I've sort of repaired my relationship to my youngest son, who also lives in this area. So, you know, I shouldn't complain. But it's a new challenge. And so that's good. Fortunately, I've met someone who's filling that void in my life. And so everything's good. Now I got to do these videos, or I want to do the videos. You know, everybody likes to think that they have some knowledge or experience that's beneficial to other people. And I'm no exception to that. It's the bit of ego all of us have, and I'm no exception. Well, I'm going to shut this down for now. It's been running a very long time. And put it in my work in progress library and cut it up and use it the best I can. All righty, goodbye.